Hi, folks, it's Kevin. I just wanted to say a brief word before the podcast begins. When I started Season 2 of SaskScapes, one of the stories I wanted to feature in the series was that of the 60's scoop. Now, if you're not aware of this rather dark time in Canadian history and culture, I hope by the end of these 4 episodes you will be. From the early 1960s through the late 1980s, there was a mass removal of Aboriginal children from their families into the child welfare system, and in most cases without the consent of their families or bands. So an estimated 20,000 were scooped up, hence the name 60's Scoop. Well, this is the first of 4 conversations I had with 4 individuals who were taken from their families as children. Now, they are sad stories, true, but well, they're also stories of strength and courage, cultural pride, and, well, maybe most importantly, forgiveness. Well, I feel very honored to have had the opportunity to sit and listen to these stories, and I believe we have much to learn from them. Dr. Raven Sinclair is my guest for this episode. Now, on to the podcast. You're listening to SaskScapes, a podcast featuring the stories of arts, culture, and heritage in Saskatchewan. Dr. Raven Sinclair, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
From the beginning, you're originally from the Treaty 4 area?
Yes. I'm from Gordon's First Nation. Well, that's where my mother was from. My dad, if he had lived to reapply for his status, would have belonged to Kawakatus, which is the neighboring First Nation. But in our family, historically, the Crees, we belong to their mother's band, and so we all belong to Gordon's First Nation, which is down south, yeah.
Okay, and so the town...
The town nearby?
Yeah.
That I grew up. The town nearby Gordon's is Punachai.
Okay.
Right? I didn't grow up there. I've never lived on reserve.
Okay.
I was actually born in a little town just across the border called Oyen, Alberta.
Oh, right.
Yeah. My father was a farm laborer, so he went down the highway from town to town. So 2 of us were born in Oyen, and then 2 were born in the next town in Cereal, Alberta. And so that's, we were sort of born in different places. I think a couple of my siblings were born on reserve. Yeah.
Right.
But so where was I raised? Not on reserve. So I was born in Alberta. Then when my father passed away, my mother moved us all to Saskatoon within a couple of years, and because her sister lived here, and I think she probably needed the support of her sister rather than taking in laundry in a small town, strange foreign town in Alberta. And then we came into contact with child welfare fairly shortly after we got back to Saskatoon.
Now, there were 9 of you at this point?
There were 9 of us, yeah. And then I believe we lived with my auntie, and she had 5 children, so there was a huge pack of us.
No kidding. And where did you place in the family of 9?
I was the youngest.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I'm the youngest child of my dad. My mother subsequently had 2 more children, who are, just 2 and 3 or 4 years younger than me. So we came into contact with the child welfare system within a couple of years, and I remember being in foster care. I don't have a sense of how long it was. It was too long, because I have some memories of the abuse and the physical and the sexual abuse. And then all of a sudden one day it was on my birthday, actually, my 5th birthday. I was taken to this new shiny house in what is now Richmond Heights. and which was at that time at the edge of the city.
So
it was a brand new suburb.
What was that day like? Somebody just shows up at the door? Or?
Well, what happened was we were treated like little animals in the foster home. And so all of a sudden I was put in these, nice clothes. And I was in the kitchen. I was allowed to sit in the kitchen at the table, which I never had before. So I was quite nervous. Something strange was going on here. And my foster mother was being very nice to me, which was also, very anxiety provoking because she was a very nasty woman. Mm. She quite enjoyed, hitting us and beating us. And she gave me milk and cookies. And, it was like, this was just too weird for me. I was very fearful because I knew something was up and she insisted I eat these. So I ate these milk and cookies. And I think what it was that she was trying to present an appearance to a social worker that was coming over to take me. Yeah. And my next sort of snippet of memory is being in the social worker's car with all of these presents around me and balloons. And I knew they were mine, but I hadn't opened them, so I didn't know. So again, I think that was a little bit of appearance for the adoptive family. That here's this child with all these gifts and looking all dressed up and so on. Anyways, so then I remember being in this house and being introduced to these people, and it was very different. It was a big house, a sprawling bungalow up on the riverbank out in Richmond Heights, and that's where I suddenly stayed, and that's how it happened.
So you would have seen your mother, the last memory of seeing your own mom? The
last memory was at some point before we were apprehended, because I also remember the day that we were apprehended.
Now, how much notice had your mom had that this was going to happen?
She didn't get any notice.
No, so they just showed up at the door?
Well, the police came to the door because she was off with her sister somewhere, and because there were so many of the kids, the older ones took care of the younger ones. So we were on our own. She was off doing something, I'm not sure what, and the police came and apprehended us and took us to Kilburn Hall, which at that time was a children's receiving home, and then from there we were all placed in foster care. As I understand it. We stayed there for, I think it was, maybe not too long, a few months. And
all of your siblings went, or just the younger ones?
All of us were put into foster care.
All 9 of you?
Yeah. But I believe that the older ones either ran away or ran back home fairly soon. Okay. Because I was the oldest of us three younger ones that was placed for adoption. Mm-hmm. So I was 5, and then my younger sister was also placed for adoption, and the youngest boy, and I think he might have been apprehended at birth, if not shortly after.
When you were in foster home, were you allowed to have any contact with each other?
Well, I was placed with one of my sisters, so not the sister that's next older than me, but the one that's actually, she was the second youngest girl, and so she's 2 siblings older than me. Mm-hmm. And then in the house next door were the 2 that were in between the 2 of us in age. So I had contact with my sister that was in the house with me. We sort of clung together for support. But we weren't allowed to speak to our siblings that lived in the house next door. And they weren't allowed to speak to us. And my sister said that, one day I just went marching out to go and see them, and she wouldn't let me. And I got really angry at her because, of course, I blamed her for not letting me. And she said, no, I was just saving you from a beating because we weren't allowed any contact with them.
What was life like in the foster home?
Well, it was brutal. Yeah. I think I just thankfully when you experience trauma as a child, you block out most of the painful things. I do remember being spanked regularly. And I just remember the sort of general sense of fear that I carried. And, my sister was older than me, of course, about 4 years older than me. So she was a lot more aware, and she said it was really just hell on earth. We didn't eat with the family. We got different food. They were very racist towards us. And then the sexual abuse happened, and the mother knew that the sexual abuse was going on. And there are some specific incidents that we both remember that were indications that she was fully aware and condoned that behavior in her son, who was 12. And yeah, it was a really disgusting place. And but then when I have those memories of the day that I was adopted, it does. She was very sort of manipulative because she would put on an appearance for the social worker.
Right.
So they would come and everything would be great. We'd probably be sitting in the living room or something of this teeny small house on the west side. But she would make it look as if we were being treated well when we weren't. And so happily I was adopted and placed on my birthday, which is in the early fall. My sister unfortunately had to stay there for another, I believe it was about 8 months, and she said it was horrible without me, but also just the abuse and the violence. Yeah, the abuse on many levels. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I remember about the foster home. And so when I look at the recent report that came out a few years ago, it doesn't seem to have changed very much. Indigenous children, I think, are so vulnerable in foster care, and what do you do other than have 24-hour surveillance on these people?
Right.
But at that time, so many homes weren't screened, and people would say, "Oh yeah, we'll take care of these kids and we'll do a good job," and they'd agree to that. But then what happened behind closed doors was a very different matter, and the story after story, I would say that the majority of adoptees would have stories of foster care that are really just.
Hey, it's Kevin. I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. Just a quick reminder that the SaskScapes podcast is available for free on your favorite podcast app, or you can stream it from your browser. Check out the show notes for the link. On the SaskScapes homepage, you'll notice something new under the logo called SaskScapes Plus. You can't miss it. There's a big button saying support with a heart icon next to it. I'd love it if you could click on that button and help keep this podcast series going. When SaskScapes launched in May 2014, it was the first podcast in the province celebrating arts, culture, and heritage. In fact, you'd have been pretty hard-pressed to find any Saskatchewan podcasts. So I'd like to think that we paved the way. It's been because of your support that this podcast is now in its 9th year. Okay, that's it. Enjoy the rest of the episode.
Terrible.
So the family you were adopted into was a dreadful scenario as well.
No, not at all.
Not at all. No.
Yeah, no. It was a beautiful house. My father was a professor and theologian at the University of Saskatchewan, and my mother had a degree in nursing, so she was a psychiatric nurse. And I was adopted into a family that had 2 older boys and an older sister. Although my sister is fairly close in age to me, and so we were what was called artificially twinned. So even though she's white and I'm obviously Indigenous, my mother liked to dress us the same and sort of treat us as if we were twins, which was really ridiculous because it was probably cute, but it was pretty ridiculous because our lives were very different. We certainly weren't twins in any sense of the word.
Right.
I think my sister had a very hard time with my adoption, and in some respects maybe still does. It's hard to say, but she hasn't had an easy time of it.
What was your understanding as a child as to why you were taken from your family?
Well, family? I was given the standard line that your family couldn't take care of you, and so they made the best decision for you, and so here you are with us, and we're going to be your forever and ever family.
Did you buy it?
Oh, I fell for it hook, line, and sinker. Yeah. I didn't actually discover until I reunited with my birth family and my mom, and I asked her, what happened, and she said, well, they just took you. And I didn't sign any papers, and she said about a year later I got a notice in the mail that you were being adopted, and I had to go to court. And she said, so I went to court on that day, and I remember that day as well.
Did she?
By that time, she was a stranger to me.
Now, this I'm hearing already in the other people that I've spoken with.
She wanted me. She was opposed to the adoption, but they just pushed it through. And they actually asked me, at the age of 6, if I wanted to live with her or if I wanted to live with this family, this only family that I had known now for, at least a year or more. Mm-hmm. And, so logically I said, my family. Because I didn't know her anymore, as a child, a year is a lifetime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How much contact, if any, did you have with your birth family when you were in your adopted parents' home? Were you?
None
at all. Ever?
I didn't see them for 20 years. So I came out to Saskatoon when I was 26, so 21 years, other than that one moment in court. And I found them in 1986. I came out for a visit in 87, and then I moved out back to Saskatchewan. I was living in Ontario at the time. I moved back to Saskatchewan in 88, specifically to spend time with my family and to get to know them and repatriate.
Were they all still in the province?
They were all still in the province. Yeah, they thought I was living in Germany because the year after I was adopted, my father went on sabbatical in West Germany, and so we moved there, and that's where I started elementary school. And they somehow knew this, maybe through the social worker. And so my oldest sister, said that she took German lessons in high school because she was planning to go over there to find me.
Well, she's got German in her.
Yeah, so we can communicate in German.
Do you know German?
I do, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Ein bisschen, yeah.
Right. What was the day like when you reconnected with your birth mom?
Oh, yeah, that was an interesting day. I actually reconnected with my younger sister first. So, here's an interesting twist to the story. So my father was a theologian and professor at St. Andrews at the University of Saskatchewan, and my younger sister's father was also a theologian. The United Church was very involved in the Adopt Indian Métis program. And so my father actually taught her father in university. And as children, after our adoptions, we were in the same sort of social circles, and we played together and spent time together. But our parents didn't know that we were siblings, and we didn't know that we were siblings.
Wow.
Yeah. And so she has a different father, so she's not a Sinclair by birth, right? But her partner at the time is a distant cousin of mine through my father's side, right? And so what happened was I was in Toronto working for the administrative office of Anishinaabe-Aski Nation, which is Treaty 9. And I was talking to one of the researchers who's, incidentally from Saskatchewan, and she said, you should connect with your family because you're kind of displaced here. And I said, I wouldn't know how to start. And she said, well, you're a Sinclair. She said, that's a really common name out there. She said, Jim Sinclair is the president of at the time, Métis non-status Indians in Saskatchewan. She said, send him a letter. So I did, and 11 days later, my younger sister, who had been adopted, called me because her partner at the time was Jim Sinclair, who was my dad's cousin, so, a cousin uncle of mine, was his, she was with one of his nephews, right? So one of my cousins on my dad's side. And she called me up and said, you better sit down. This stranger calls me up. So I sat down and she goes, I'm your sister. And I went, oh my God. And my first question was, is Mom alive? And she said, yes. And it's funny because that's all I wanted to know. I love my siblings, and I miss them and longed for them, but it was most important that my mother was still alive. And she said, yes, she's alive, and so we talked for quite a long time on the phone, and she told me a little bit about her experience of reconnecting with the family, because for her it was there were some really positive things about it, but there were some challenges too. My sister and I were raised, and my youngest brother as well. We were raised in United Church families, so really upwardly mobile. We had a lot of advantages. A very white Anglo-Saxon Protestant context, and my family was not raised that way. They were, they struggled with poverty, and my family's, my Sinclairs are very, very smart. My family are very, very intelligent people, but at the same time confronted with poverty and just sort of the whole culture of the west side inner city of Saskatoon, and so there was, I think, a culture clash for us. It was fairly shocking, maybe in some respects, because neither of us had ever been exposed to poverty, and so. There was some challenges for both of us, and for my siblings as well, because I think sometimes, they might have thought that we were snooty or something, but it wasn't that. It was just, for us, I think it was about reconciling our socialization, the way we had been trained to view the world, with the reality that was a pretty isolated picture.
Right, because yours was not
narrow and insulated, and that the spectrum of human life in Saskatchewan and Canada as well. Mm-hmm. There's a huge range, right? So we don't live in mansions or anything, but we also didn't suffer extreme poverty, and so for both of us, it was just a process of understanding that there's a lot more diversity out there in the world, and that and that our roots. My roots are much different than the way I was socialized, than say my adoptive siblings' roots are. Yeah. And so I came out the following year. I talked to my other siblings shortly after that, at least a few of them. And that was pretty amazing too. I remember in particular getting on the phone with my oldest sister, and I think in terms of genetics, that's one of the most significant things that you get to experience when you're an adoptee and you repatriate, is suddenly being in the presence of people that look like you and maybe even act like you, the idiosyncrasies that arise out of genetic similarity. And so getting on the phone with my sister was such an interesting experience, because we have the same voice, and then meeting her in person, we had the same pictures on the walls, and we listened to the same music, and it was so amazing, to have that connection. And it's the same with all of my siblings, and even lots of my cousins and uncles and aunties. I don't think it's as marked with many of them, but there's something there. There's that recognition at such a deep level of something in you that you see mirrored in other people.
So on a cellular level, we are more than our environment.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So, and that was so interesting, because, she's my oldest sister's 5 years older than me, and yet, so we're not twins, and yet, what it tells me is that there's something about our cellular, our genetic makeup that, we manifest certain things in the world, and there's certain things that we like, and maybe for her and I, some of those genetic markers are similar, and so, similar taste in music, similar, ways of being in the world, even mannerisms, inflections in the voice. The only difference is she's a vegetarian and I'm a carnivore. And that's not going to change.
Right. So the day you were all together, were you all together for the first time at any point?
Yes. Well, when I decided to come out for a visit in 1987, I believe. 86 or 87, I can't quite remember. So I flew out to Saskatoon, and there was a whole bunch of them at the airport. So most of my siblings and some maybe a cousin and an auntie and uncle and my mom were all there. And I just remember getting off the plane and seeing, this little crowd of brown people down there, and it was very, it was quite a significant moment in my life. Because what happened? Yeah. Well, yeah, I say that, but I'm sitting here sort of physically, viscerally remembering it, and it's like, oh, it was huge.
Yeah.
I don't really even have the words to explain that feeling of.
Don't know if there is one.
Yeah, I don't know that there is. But one of the things that happens when you're an adoptee, especially if you're Indigenous in a white family, because it was that the thing has existed within this culture of silence. I didn't see another Indigenous person really until like grade 11. I'd see the occasional street person. There weren't as many people in urban centers, and we lived in Toronto and Kingston, and there just wasn't the urban population. So my exposure was so limited, and so I grew up in this void, in this sort of cultural and identity void in terms of my indigeneity. And so I never, in the world around me, I didn't have any of those sort of mirrors of no mirrors that reflected my identity as a Cree child. And so to suddenly, without any preparation, I should have been more prepared, but suddenly without any preparation to encounter my family, my brown family, it was beautiful. It was wonderful. It was also very shocking and very tumultuous, emotionally and psychologically tumultuous for me. And I think that happens for lots of people initially. And yeah.
And when you saw your mom?
Oh, I just cried. Yeah, I just hugged her and cried. And I was surprised at how small she was. Just teeny tiny. And but I recognized her. I recognized her for sure. I remembered her.
And you can't reinvent that bond that one would naturally have with a mother had you stayed with your mom, right? I mean, this is, you're getting to know a stranger, as you said. Did you?
Yeah.
Had you?
Well, that's true. But at the same time, I was with my family until I was 4. So those are really, in terms of psychological theory, those are really, really significant early developmental stages. And I used to wonder why I was so resilient, because, things would happen, like I was bullied and tormented almost daily at school because I was a brown kid, right? But I was a little bit feisty. I had this sort of inner feistiness, and at the core, even though it was devastating and led to some pretty significant psychological issues as a teenager and young adult, I still had this sort of fundamental core of strength. And the prevailing message within that strength was that you're wrong about me. I'm not those names. I'm not those things that you're saying about me. And I feel, within me very strongly that it's because I was with my family for those first 4 and 7 years. And because of that acceptance, that unconditional love, that nurturing, I was part of a happy pack of lots of kids, and everybody had my back. And I remember that sensation of my siblings just taking care of me. And I had a hard time keeping up because I was younger and might have been sort of a pesky little toddler and that sort of thing. But they always took care of me. And we had that sort of freedom and liberation to play and do things that kids do, which I didn't have after my adoption. I had to be socialized in a very sort of, waspy with Victorian roots kind of approach to childhood.
But when you came to your adoptive parents and said, when you were being bullied, did they have your back?
No. They carried the belief. They didn't understand. I mean, my dad understood years later when he sort of took some time to critically analyze it, but they didn't understand that they believed that Canada was not a racist country. They didn't understand anything about being a racialized person. So when I encountered obstacles and difficulties, they just assumed it was something that I was doing. so blaming the victim sort of mentality that, and the Protestant sort of ethics would emerge. They'd say things like, just be nicer and just work harder and be more friendly, and so as if I had to change something because
Right.
in order to change my environment. But I mean the issue is so much bigger than that, right? And we're in such a racially divided country. People have to stop believing this myth, because it's all it is. It's an absolute myth. And if you are a person of color in this country, you live in a very different world. And because I've lived in a WASP world, I understand that to be true. I know it to be true from experience. And yeah.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. Did you know that full versions of SaskScapes can be downloaded or streamed for free from the iTunes Store, Stitcher Radio, and on SoundCloud? Feel free to leave us a review or star rating. And now, back to the podcast. In reconnecting with your birth mom, did she ever get the chance to share with you what she went through emotionally, seeing you all taken away from her?
My mother was very reticent and quite emotionally and psychologically, I would say, withdrawn. Now, she went through Gordon's residential school, and yeah, it was a pretty bad one, and she really wouldn't talk about it. My siblings said that she would, she was a Cree speaker, but she'd been trained not to speak it. So she would only speak Cree with her sister when they were, imbibing alcohol. And, so I can't remember the question.
Did she ever had a chance to?
Oh, right. Yeah. So she was very, she was a closed book in many respects.
Right.
Shortly after we were taken away, she started working at the Best Bureau cleaning rooms she did that for 30 years without a pension, I would add.
Oh.
And so she managed to kind of get herself together, and she worked so hard her whole life. And so a bunch of siblings were able to go back to her, and so that's a good thing. But when I came back, of course, I wanted to know what had happened, and so I spent a lot of time with my siblings, and they would tell me stories about that time period, and just some of the challenges and how they would react to sometimes the parties that would happen and that sort of thing. I mean, it wasn't sort of hugely out of control, but enough so that she went out one day and someone reported that we were alone, even though my oldest brother was 12. Like that's you could take care of younger kids when you're that age, and my sister was I don't know, 9 or something, and she was always taking care of me. Right? So I mean, yeah, there was some bickers between adults that led to our involvement with child welfare. But she was very reticent to talk about her residential school experience. The only thing she ever said to me was, well, it had some good points. And that's the only thing that she ever said about it. The other thing that happened with my mom is that, so she has 3 siblings, two older brothers and an older sister. And so when the Indian Act was changed in the 50s, because my grandmother had married ostensibly a Métis man, he was actually, would have been a treaty member of Pine Creek in Manitoba. But because she had married him and he didn't have Indian status, then her descendants, so my aunts and uncles, my mom included, were considered to be non-status, and they were kicked off the reserve. So at the time my mom was 14, her sister was 16, and the 2 older boys were around 18, 19. And so what happened was the 2 boys were adopted by a grandfather on the reserve, and they actually changed their name and stayed on the reserve. And my mom and her older sister, they left the reserve and they went to live in Punachai, where they started working in the local hotel as chambermaids. And so my mom's sister, I guess, raised her. And then fairly young, my mother met my dad and got married and started having babies. And so, she was pretty angry about that, and the reason that they were kicked off the reserve was because her mother died. Her mother died fairly young of cancer, I think. I'm not sure what. But that was very, very traumatic for her. And so she never went back to the reserve until, I think it was about 96, actually drove her back to the reserve because she was ill at that time. And she knew that if she didn't go, she probably wouldn't have a chance to go back and see some of her friends and relatives down there. And so a bunch of us took a little road trip down and visited. And she had a chance to visit with her childhood best friend and just kind of, make her peace with that experience, I think. But I asked her too about the adoption and the apprehension. And all she said was that she'd never signed anything. And, just what I already told you. That she didn't sign anything, and then she got this notice that she needed to come and appear in court. And she didn't even know what that was all about. She didn't really understand. Nobody explained anything to her, and so, yeah.
How much time do you get to spend with your birth family now?
We don't spend that much time together. I see them sporadically and, on special occasions. I have a brother that lives up north. He likes fishing and that sort of thing, and so he lives up in the north. And then I have a number of siblings here in town, and I have a pretty busy life too, and they do too. One of my sisters is a teacher, and so she's traveled around a bit, teaching in different locations, and so we don't spend that much time together. I'm connected on Facebook with lots of my siblings and extended family, so that's great. But again, my life is pretty full. And
what's your connection with your adopted family now?
Well, it's probably about the same. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and so she's sort of the focus of my world.
Right.
But in terms of my adoptive family, my father, my adoptive parents divorced when I was 15, and I was really happy about that because my adoptive mother and I didn't connect, and I found her treatment of me to be highly questionable, and so I was very pleased when she left our family home, and so she took my sister with her, and so my brothers were emancipated by that time. So I was just with my dad, and we had a chance to develop our relationship, and he became my best friend. And he reparented me in lots of ways. He eventually remarried a beautiful woman who is, I consider one of my now 3 moms. And I probably have more contact with her than anybody. My dad passed away from Alzheimer's in 2010. And so, for the last 10 years, I would say I wasn't able to have much of a relationship with him because, he wasn't really lucid anymore. But up until that point, we had a very strong relationship. I talked to him, as regularly as possible, and he was very encouraging. And it's probably why I got a PhD, is because I wanted to be like him.
Yes, that was good.
I was greatly influenced by his worldview and his approach to the world. And of all the people in my life, he was the only one that ever said to me, we had no business adopting you. And he said, don't get me wrong, I love you. And this was in we would talk about anything and everything. And in one of our conversations, we often talked about racism in later years. Because, as a teenager, I wasn't able to articulate to him my experiences. But then as I got older, and had dealt with a lot of it through therapy and that sort of thing, it just became easier to talk about. And so we would talk at length about, pretty much anything. And so when we were talking about racism, he said that he really disagreed with the whole program, and he had been opposed to it right from the beginning. He he said as a younger man, he didn't really have sort of the critical insight to understand how flawed that AIM program was. He said, but he just knew that white people had no business adopting Indigenous children, and that culturally that there was something really, really wrong about it. And so, but my mother was insistent, and so she, in recent years, I asked her, "Why did you adopt me? Because you didn't treat me very well." And she said, "Well, your sister needed a playmate." And this was just a few years ago. We were at Earl's here in Saskatoon. I said, "Mom, are you, do you hear yourself? Like, you don't adopt a child to give your birth child a playmate. That's not the way it works." And she says, "Wow,
Yeah, get a puppy."
Exactly, get a puppy. And so that's just sort of to illustrate a little bit of the issues that I was confronted with growing up in her presence. But I love her, and I know that she did the best that she could with what she had at the time, and she comes out of a very sort of specific era as well, in rural, small town Saskatchewan, and so I have compassion for her. But my dad, he was very insightful, and he as he got older, he'd get more and more irate about the whole thing, and he said, we had no business adopting you, because as much as I love you, I couldn't teach you what it means to be an Indigenous child. And he said, I think that just really puts you at a disadvantage. And then he'd say things like, you've done so great, and I'm so proud of you, and I love you, and you're so amazing and awesome and wonderful. He was always saying great things to me. It would embarrass me. But he said, I'm just glad that you were able to kind of, survive it all. Yeah.
So he influenced the education that you pursued, which is extremely impressive.
Thank you.
You're a doctor of social work.
Mm-hmm.
You maintain a practice here as well.
Yes.
A little
bit?
I
have a consulting company, so I go. I do talks. I'm really interested in the whole area of lateral violence intervention and communications training. So I do some talks and workshops, and as I've learned more about Indigenous knowledge, one of the other areas that really intrigues me is Indigenous ethics, and how it connects with I was raised in the United Church, and a lot of it was pretty flawed, just in terms of people's ethics and behaviors. But at its core, in terms of, I feel pretty strongly about religious philosophies, and that at their core, there are some universal concepts that hold true. And these I see as being aligned with natural laws, as I've been taught them by Sylvia McAdam, who's one of the founders of Island of Moore. And it just intrigues me, the whole notion of ethics, and how, the laws that were given to the Cree people they're so profound, and they can guide our behavior, and our conduct with other people, and how we engage with each other and the world around us. And so, as I learn, I share these things with other people, and I'm sort of uniquely positioned, I think, because of my upbringing. I grew up in one world, and then as an adult, I reacculturated to my Indigenous world, and started to learn from elders and attend ceremonies and cultural events and that sort of thing. And so, I've had that. That's one of the gifts I think that came out of the adoption, is having those experiences, and then sort of being able to stand in the middle and look at both and see, okay, what are the points of synergy here between these two worldviews? And I have to say, there aren't many, but the place, that space of spirituality, which I see as sort of the core of religions, is one of those places where there is tremendous synergy. Yeah. And so that interests me. And and I've been hugely influenced by my father, because I've seen, I think we've all seen where religion can be manipulated and used to cause tremendous harm in the world. But my father, not only was he a spiritual man, but he was a religious man, and he endeavored always to walk his talk. And at times he came under huge fire because he held fast to certain ethical principles that are fundamental to Protestantism. And but that role modeling for me was pretty significant. And so yes, he influenced me tremendously. Yeah. And it was, for me, it was either do a PhD in social work or do a law degree. And I have to say that I think social work was a good choice, for sure.
Your upbringing, compared to many others, seems quite fortunate when I have heard other stories that don't mirror yours as far as environment and educational opportunity. Yeah. But I would ask this of you, as well as your opinion of those who went through formative years in less than ideal circumstances, which then caused them to have very tumultuous teenage and adult lives. This is a sweepingly general question to ask you, but how do you heal and how do you move through life not being bitter and not expecting an apology, and would an apology ever matter or do it? Well, not expecting an apology. I hope to hear that that's going to happen because the Premier has indicated that that's going to happen. And to me, the apology isn't so much about, sort of individually, I'm sorry about what happened to you, but it's about acknowledging what we have all known to be true, which was that this whole program of Native transracial adoption in Canada was fundamentally flawed. That the premises, the impetus for this movement was wrong. And, I don't sort of expect the government to have a really in-depth critical analysis of, the economics of it or a critical race theory of it. But to me, the acknowledgement that a wrong was done, a wrong was perpetrated, is so important. How does it affect me personally? In terms of my personal experience, I'm a pretty happy person now, but I almost didn't survive. And that's the problem, is that human beings, well, I don't know if it's a problem or the gift, human beings were really, really resilient. Right? And what concerns me is when people say things like, well, you turned out fine, so it had to all be good. Yeah.
Well, it wasn't all good. And so by the time I was a teenager, I was extremely suicidal and living in a constant state of post-traumatic stress and hypervigilance and fear and anxiety. And, I was institutionalized, I was on medication. And, it was after that period where I made the decision that, okay, I'm going to see if I can do something about this. And there would be certain junctures where I would meet key people who would support my healing journey. And my dad was he was sort of a beacon of faith and patience. And as I slowly started to internalize that, yes, he did love me. He loved me unconditionally. It gave me a little bit of a drive to want to see what I could do with my life, but also to deal with these ways of this pain that I was carrying. And so, as a young adult, I started having some pretty, I think, serious mental illness issues. And a friend of mine, who is a friend to this day, said, Raven, you need therapy. because I was having very strange dreams and all sorts of things. And so I started therapy. I started therapy as a young adult, and really haven't stopped. It's morphed into more training now, but I went through years of therapy and years of group work and grief work, and that was essential. That was really, really essential. So it was like for the first 20 some years of my life, I experienced turmoil, and then for the next 20 some years of my life, I worked very diligently at healing. And now I'm in this place where it's like, oh, phew, I can relax now because it's all good. It's all good. And yes, I experienced lots of trauma and turmoil and almost didn't survive. But, with the support of people over the next 20 years, I've been able to see the gift of all of those experiences. And, so I'm happy about that, and that's the thing when I talk about this apology, it really needs to come with reparation, so that I've sort of been fortunate because I've often been in a position where I've been able to access mental health services, and have those covered, but a lot of people don't, and so for so many of my peers who are still struggling, it's like they need that support. They really need that support. So yeah, all of our stories are very, very different. And I know, I wrote in my dissertation that in some ways my story, it has some pretty horrible parts. But in the overall scheme of things, my story is somewhat mundane compared to some of the, almost all of the participants to my dissertation research who shared their life stories with me. And I marvel at how these people survived at the resilience of the human spirit over, living in those conditions of oppression in contexts where, it's supposed to be a nurturing context.
I would not call your story mundane. And I do not want to dismiss the pain and the period of growth you had to go through to get to where you are now. But you are, and I've only known you for an hour, but you're an amazing energy.
Thank you.
You're an extremely strong person, but very real person.
One of the things that I really need to articulate is that one of the most beautiful things about being an adoptee is that most of us, I'd say 98% reacculturate. And that's the gift in itself, is that we have the opportunity to reacculturate to this incredibly beautiful culture and identity. And that, that's going to be the journey for the rest of my life. But within my culture, the knowledge and the teachings, when I was a kid, I used to have these different, I guess you could call them as spiritual experiences. And there was no way for me to be able to understand what those were all about. And I remember as a young teenager, I started having these dreams where Cree women were talking to me in the language. And when I told my dad, he was worried I was developing schizophrenia. Later on, when I started to learn from elders, this one elder from Ontario, Gladys Kidd, she's gone away, she's passed now, but she said that's because at that time in life, Cree women are supposed to have they're transitioning from childhood to adulthood. They were trying to give you those teachings that you couldn't get because you were in the wrong place, and it was beautiful. So she gave me the teachings, and I have learned more as I've gone along. But it's such an incredibly powerful culture, and really beautiful and sacred. And so that's where I've really that's really given me my strength and my any sort of amazingness that I have is because the ancestors have guided me.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
What a pleasure to meet you.
Which
translates to be?
All my relations.
Thanks for listening. The SaskScapes podcast is created and hosted by Kevin Power for Sask Culture. Funding to the cultural sector is provided through the Saskatchewan Lotteries Trust Fund for Sport, Culture, and Recreation. For more information, visit iheartculture.ca and saskculture.ca. Music for SaskScapes is provided by Saskatchewan-born singer-songwriter Jeffrey Straker. There's no end to the stories to be told. So, until next time...